Okay, good afternoon. Good afternoon. Can everybody hear me?
Hey, let's get started.
Okay, good afternoon. Thank you all for coming to the 7th in a series of educational programs discussing the negative social, economic, environmental, and health hazards of concentrated animal feeding operations. Today, our speaker is Dr. George Fournier, who will speak on health hazards. Dr. Fournier?
Thank you so much. I have a little bit of a disclaimer. I'm a member of the Yankton Medical Clinic, and what I got to say today doesn't reflect their official position. So I just want to let everybody know that I'm not speaking for the clinic. I'm speaking for myself. The data that I'll talk about today is all verifiable. It's all on the internet, and I'll give some key references that people can look up to verify what I say. I'd like to talk today about the health hazards of hog CAFOs. The design of the barns is such that they really do breed. They're just a perfect cauldron for creating health problems. There are basically 4 aspects to it. 3 of them are manure. One is the manure production. Huge amounts of manure are produced. Manure storage, manure management, and flu virus production. The current designs that are being approved are open curtain forced ventilation designs that are open to contamination by birds, which is very, very important. They have a slatted floor with the manure collection basement underneath the pigs. There's no effective odor control. The barns are such that they have to be ventilated at a high enough rate to keep the level of hydrogen sulfide at a low enough level so that it wouldn't damage the hogs. The hog barns that have been approved are limited to 2,400 hogs, which avoids a lot of regulation. Many are located only within a few feet of the aquifer close to the river. The manure pool is supposed to be high tech, but as I found out from a good contractor friend of mine, a cement contractor, he said there are 3 realities of life: death, taxes, and cracked concrete. So I think that regardless of the design of the pool, if the concrete is used, we can expect it to crack at some point. Problems with the design. The toxic gases are generated in the manure pool through the anaerobic processing of the stool and urine. You have the mixing of stool and urine. It has to be vented. There's basically a 2-mile effect from the gases that are produced. It's very well documented in multiple studies, both in Iowa and in the Middle East and in North Carolina, that the emissions from the gaseous emissions from the hogs affect people with respiratory diseases within a 2-mile radius of the facility. There's also the wild bird exposure, which brings in, exposes the hogs to avian viruses, which I'll explain about later in the talk. The pig confinement itself, just the fact that the pigs are in such close proximity and contacting each other all the time. You get one hog that gets sick from a virus, the entire operation gets contaminated within a few weeks because of the infectivity of many of these viruses, and that's true of the avian viruses. Manure management, as far as I can tell, it really isn't anything other than spreading it as fertilizer, which creates a big problem because there are few enforceable regulations about how much manure you put on a particular field. Studies from Iowa have shown that a lot of pathogens that exist in the manure get washed into the surface water and can be isolated in high numbers for weeks after the manure is applied. And that's where the manure runoff pollutes the water. It's not only the pathogens that are in the water, but also there's a lot of nitrates and phosphates that contaminate the water. And I would say the most egregious example is in Iowa, where cities are having to spend tens of millions of dollars in cleaning equipment to get rid of the nitrates in the water just to meet minimal water standards. Now, why is the manure such a big problem? The reason is that pigs produce a lot of manure. This comes from the University of Wisconsin Extension Center. 150 to 200 pound finishing hog produces anywhere from 9.8 to 13 pounds of stool per day, per pig. A 375 pound sow and litter produces 22.5 pounds of litter per day. And the finishing hogs produce roughly 10 up to 13 times what a human produces per day. So that means really that each hog produces about 10 times the manure volume that a human produces. So a 2,400 hog facility puts out the manure output equivalent of 24,000 humans. I don't know how many hog barns are envisioned for this area, but I've heard as many as 60. Some people tell me that might be an underestimate. But 60 hog CAFOs would produce 1.4 million, would produce the equivalent of 1.4 million stool output that would be produced by 1.4 million people. That's 1.6 times the population of the state of South Dakota. The gases affect the 2-mile radius around each CAFO. The gases would affect an area of roughly 12.5 square miles. With 60 CAFOs, the total area would be 720 square miles. Yankton County is only 532 square miles in size. So it's a huge, huge problem. Now, CAFO-associated disease hazards. For the people living in the immediate area of the CAFO, asthma and COPD exacerbation is a big problem. It comes from the emissions, the gaseous emissions from the barn, which also includes a lot of hog dander and dust. Now that hog dander is immunogenic in itself. In other words, it causes inflammatory responses in the small airways, but it's also full of what we call endotoxin, which is basically the thing that causes sepsis, and it's very, very inflammatory. So it creates an inflammatory reaction in the small airways, and clearly makes chronic obstructive pulmonary disease and asthma a lot worse. Pathogens documented that have been isolated from not only the dander, but also from the runoff from fields where the hog manure has been applied are E. coli, Giardia, Salmonella, and there was a recent paper which found large amounts of hepatitis E, which will infect humans. It's a disease about as severe as hepatitis A is. And of course, methicillin-resistant Staph aureus, MRSA. Now the MRSA is particularly bad because in the hospital and in the clinic, we go through a lot of precautions to try to limit the spread of MRSA. Now these hog CAFOs can produce MRSA in millions of tons. And so the prevalence of MRSA in the community is inevitably going to go up if the hog manure is used as fertilizer. Now, here's the other interesting thing, is that hog confinements have been shown to enhance flu epidemics. Hogs are a source of novel flu virus rearrangements. The way it happens is that the pigs are able to be infected by both bird viruses and human viruses at the same time. And it's that co-infection that leads to a kind of a cauldron of rearrangements of the viruses such that you get these novel viruses that are produced that can infect the CAFO workers. One of the major sources of spread actually are hog shows. You get an infected pig aerosolizing secretions, in other words, coughing and sneezing, and humans get infected. People get infected from the actual show. Pigs and humans are susceptible to the same viruses. H1N1 virus was responsible for the 1918 flu pandemic, which killed 50 million people worldwide. It also reemerged as a pandemic in the United States in 2009. 390 children were killed. It arose from co-infected pigs, probably in Mexico, and spread worldwide. Now, there's one really very concerning situation sort of evolving in Southeast Asia. There was an outbreak of H5N1, which is a avian-human rearrangement virus that infected about 400 people in Southeast Asia. The mortality rate of those infections was 69%. The mortality rate for the H1N1 flu pandemic was 25%. So there's a virus present in Southeast Asia, and that could eventually wind up worldwide. Now, the real problem are the variant flu viruses. In other words, you have these co-infected pigs producing variant viruses that then infect humans. Now, these are viruses that have the characteristics of both avian and human viruses, and they also have the ability to infect people. And they're produced in the same pig. U.S. pigs, 77.5% of at least assayed U.S. pigs have human flu virus variants, any of which could infect humans. The flu shot is less effective for variant viruses, and this is one reason why we have such problems with the flu vaccination not covering people adequately, because the viruses are able to change every year, and they change really as a result of the reservoir that's present in the pig herd. The severity of the problem really isn't known for sure, because it's difficult for the CDC to go to individual farms and sample the pigs and trace where the viruses came from, because it's up to the farmer to let them on the property or not. So you have inadequate reporting and tracking state by state. So it's sort of a see no evil, speak no evil type of logic. Now, this is the big surprise for me that I've read lately. The flu season that we had in 2017-18 was apparently the deadliest in 40 years. CDC estimated about 80,000 people dying of flu-related illness. It was caused mainly by this virus called H3N2 variant, which is present in many pig herds. The H3N2 is endemic in U.S. pigs since 1998. It evolved to cause the virus in 2017-18. And the source is believed to be pig shows in Iowa, Michigan, and Indiana. Vaccines were only about 40% effective, 41% effective. That number actually is a little higher. I've read other papers that said it was in the high 30s. And CDC has shown that flu epidemics seem to peak faster in counties that are heavily populated by hog barns. Now, what's the economic impact of all of this? CAFOs, because of the smell, mainly, devalue the adjacent property, and it's a kind of a function of how close you live to it. So the further away you live, the less affected you are. But it can be anywhere from 3 to 88%, depending upon how far away you live from the CAFO. I've heard from presumably reliable sources that the tax yield to Yankton County would only be in the neighborhood of about maybe $600 per year per CAFO. The degradation of the environment, if you get a high enough concentration of CAFOs in here, is going to lead to population loss. In Iowa, it's very clear that there's been a migration of people from rural areas to cities, and the cities with the highest per capita income generally have the lowest number of CAFOs. There was a paper I read from the Appraisal Journal, the winter 2015 edition, said that sewage plants, sewage facilities, human sewage facilities have less impact on property values than does a hog barn. And of course, there's a huge economic impact related to flu illness, which indirectly can kill thousands of people a year. In fact, this past flu season, 80,000 people are believed to have died from flu. In 10 years in the Vietnam War, we lost less than 60,000 soldiers. So it goes to show you the magnitude of the problem. Thank you very much. Any questions? Yes?
I don't know very much about it, so right off the bat, my first question is, how close are they planning on bringing these things to actual Yankton city limits? Because most people say, well, we won't be within 2 miles, so we're fine. You know what that's going to look like as far as how they're going to be scattered around. I know it was a problem for Mission Hill, right, where they were trying to get real close to people's housing. Are they planning on that all around?
What I tried to illustrate here is that the immediate effect of the hog CAFOs, really within 2 miles, has to do with the gaseous emissions from the hog barn. But you're already being affected by viruses that are produced in hog barns. Needing to get a flu shot every year. We have a flu season November through March usually. And then the use of the manure with antibiotic-resistant bacteria and other pathogens being spread around the county, that's also an indirect effect that is not necessarily distance-related. Des Moines, Iowa, for example, is clearly affected by hog barns that are upriver from them because the taxpayers there are having to spend $18 million to clean up the water. Yes, sir?
Okay, in Des Moines, is that because of the zero discharge CAFOs, or is that from the open lots that run right down into the river?
I don't know what it's from. What it is that the nitrate level of the water that is the source for Des Moines cannot meet the minimal FDA standards or minimal governmental standards for potable water, and they're having to spend, and it's in the Des Moines Register. I mean, there's plenty of articles on this. $18.5 million to clean up the water.
Yeah, but I've heard that a lot of that is just from open lots where there is no zero discharge. When it rains, the manure runs into the creek, to the river, to Des Moines.
I know, but they also, each hog CAFO produces the stool that's used to fertilize. So it gets fertilized on ground and then it washes into the river.
It gets knifed into the ground. If the dirt washes away with it.
Knifing doesn't have much of an effect. Knifing simply maybe limits the odor a little bit, but as soon as you get rain, you have runoff of this into the
So we should
water.
quit eating meat, so we quit raising meat, so there's no pollutants, and we just breathe the exhaust fumes from the car, and we make the meat in a factory someplace.
Well, I would say that the automobile industry has been much more highly regulated and cleaned up than the hog industry.
And I'm tired of
In the
having-
1960s, we had leaded fuel all over the place. Now you can't buy it. And it's because of governmental regulation. Cars now are more efficient, they have more power, they're better, okay? Something has to be done with the meat industry. I'm not here to tell you, give you all the answers. Maybe one thing that could be done is to develop a strain of hogs that cannot be infected by bird flu, okay, and be co-infected with viruses. Maybe our flu epidemics would be reduced.
That would be the same as doing a GMO, and we've been told they're no good.
We got a lot of questions,
Go
so
ahead.
she's got one.
Not mine, okay, yeah.
We can answer some after this if you'd like. And to be respectful for everybody, let's have more than one person have an opportunity to ask questions.
My father-in-law used to raise hogs,
Yeah.
and he had to quit because he developed asthma and became allergic to all the hog dust and everything. How does that work?
How does that work?
With the,
Can you
what is,
repeat the question too, so it's on the camera, so
Yeah.
the people listening
Her
online?
father used to raise hogs, and he became, I guess, not able to do it anymore because he developed asthma and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease from the dust and dander that he was exposed to. Yeah, the way it works is this. A clean lung has these little hairs in the small airways and in the trachea that clean out the mucus that is there to trap the dust in the air and keep it out of the exchange mechanism, which is the alveoli. When you overwhelm that with dust that creates a big inflammatory reaction, you actually wind up losing cilium and those little hairs that move the mucus out. So you wind up with these mucus plugs that allow air in, but don't allow it out. The inflammatory process around the bronchial tree also causes spasm, and that's what asthma is like. This expiratory wheezing that you get when you have bronchospasm. And so the chronic exposure of an individual to the dust that's creating this tremendous inflammatory response in the lungs eventually ruins the lungs. I actually saw a 25-year-old otherwise healthy male in my office who worked at a hog confinement. And I couldn't wait to listen to his lungs. His lungs sounded like he had been smoking for 50 years. And he worked in the confinement himself. And he didn't know he had asthma, but he was wheezing all over the place. It's a serious problem. It's a real serious problem. And then somebody with pre-existing asthma is made worse by breathing even small amounts of the dander and dust from hog barns.
Okay, this might be more personal than anything.
Yeah.
I donate blood as often as I can. We're gonna have one ahead of us, we're gonna have one behind us. Now, when you breathe in, that's gonna go into my bloodstream. Am I gonna be able to donate, or is there tests out there so I don't affect somebody else if I'm affected?
Well, I guess the main things that they screen for